If Thomas Hobbes, Isaac Newton, and the other materialist revolutionaries of the scientific revolution were right when they said that all human action could be reduced to its basic mechanical motions, then what role can there be for freedom? Does freedom have any meaning in a world governed by inescapable laws of nature, by unalterable chains of cause and effect? Freedom means many things, but one indispensable quality is the freedom to choose, to make judgments based on reason, and to carry out a self-determined course of action. But for a materialist like Hobbes, this kind of freedom has no real meaning. Humans make decisions based on the likelihood of a given choice to invite or avoid pain, and in a world governed by this logic, freedom can only ever mean an immediate absence of restraint. I am free insofar as I am not physically held back. The idea that freedom can mean the ability to act creatively, to shape the world in ways determined by one's will, was irrelevant to the thinking of a mechanistic philosopher like Hobbes. The 18th century epoch we refer to as the Enlightenment was, in part, a gigantic intellectual effort to adapt the revolutionary methods of natural science to human society. In effect, it sought to establish a science of freedom, a body of empirical knowledge that, properly applied, could overcome the flaws and shortcomings of existing society and build a world of plenty and justice through the use of human reason. Virtually the entire modern vocabulary of politics emerges from the Enlightenment, both from the works of philosophers and from the actions of revolutionary masses in the streets of Europe and the Americas. Here we are interested in one of the most compelling figures of the French Enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The political theories of the French Enlightenment, as expressed in the world historical upheaval of the French Revolution, bequeathed living examples of a whole spectrum of isms we still argue over: liberalism, conservatism, socialism, constitutionalism, anarchism, and so on. Though he died before its outbreak, Rousseau is commonly thought of as a kind of intellectual godfather to the French Revolution, since the politics of the Jacobins and other radicals explicitly drew on Rousseau's thinking about human nature and democracy. Raised in the independent Protestant city-state of Geneva, Switzerland, Rousseau was a self-educated and marginal thinker. He spent many years as an itinerant teacher and tutor to wealthy patrons, who gave him the leisure to pursue his philosophical projects. His writing covered a wide range of subjects typical for intellectuals of the time. He wrote not just on politics, but also on music, theology, and education. In his lifetime, Rousseau was best known for his novels and plays, which all focused on the philosophical themes that obsessed him. But fame brought attention to the radicalism of these texts, and their Enlightenment contempt for the traditional in favor of the new. The Discourse on Inequality, written as Rousseau's entry in a prestigious French essay competition, was designed to provoke intense reaction. But reaction had its price. Rousseau was exiled from both Geneva and France for his free-thinking religious views, and he died in England after a period of severe mental illness. By this time, Rousseau had developed a reputation as one of the Enlightenment's most provocative thinkers. His works repeatedly engage the thorny problem of how to preserve human freedom in a world hostile to its development. This hostility is not just a question of political tyranny or repression, it is also a moral problem. For Rousseau, political systems require that their subjects share the same basic moral commitments. A true son of a city-state, Rousseau took for granted that a state's political survival depended upon an internal consensus regarding right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. This consensus was upheld by a common morality, which for Rousseau is a kind of paradox, since it implies a religious precondition for secular politics. Different moral systems, he argued, make certain political forms possible or impossible. A monarchy requires one set of ethical standards from its subjects, while a democracy requires a very different ethical standard for its citizens. In the Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau is concerned with the question of human origins. This is the first of his works in which he articulates his concept of the state of nature. While he starts from basic premises that resemble those of Hobbes, his analysis immediately goes in a very different direction. Like Hobbes, Rousseau began with the assumption that humans are desiring creatures, and that the will to satisfy those desires is the driving force of life. Also like Hobbes, Rousseau's claims about early humans were strongly influenced by the discourses about Native Americans and New World life that saturated early modern Europe. For a man used to life in the aristocratic households of continental Europe, especially the cultural capital of Paris, New World life seemed decidedly primitive. Whether the subjects were natives, European immigrants, or captive Africans, the societies of the New World seemed barbarous and crude to most upper-class Europeans. And according to Enlightenment thinking on the subject, primitive societies give the civilized a window into the origins of human society, which was assumed to progress through stages of increasing complexity and refinement. Native Americans exercised a particular fascination for Rousseau, since they seemed to straddle the world of nature and the world of society, and so present a living example of the historical processes that had led to the evolution of civilization. For Rousseau, Native Americans exemplified the contradiction at the heart of his thinking about human development. Humans are born free and happy in the state of nature, and they become dependent and unhappy with each step they take out of nature and into society. This decidedly pessimistic take on human history is Rousseau's unique contribution to a crucial 18th century debate. As the explanatory authority of Christian religion declined, educated Europeans began the search for a new explanation of human origins that satisfied the scientific, secular assumptions of Enlightenment thought. But science had not yet developed the tools necessary to provide the hard evidence its own standards demanded. Darwin's Origin of Species would not be published until 1859, and until then, investigations into the development of the human species would rely on speculative histories that Enlightenment thinkers generated by the dozen. For Rousseau, like Aristotle, human beings begin as just one more species of animal. Humans are products of nature who rely on their own particular qualities to adapt to the realities of life. The earliest humans were solitary, unconscious, and alone in their struggle to survive. And according to Rousseau, they were also happy. In fact, these were the only humans who could be called truly happy. No one living in a society, be it a primitive village or a modern metropolis, can claim to be as untroubled, free, and content as the first human animals. It is precisely because humans in this state are undeveloped, because none of their potential qualities or abilities have begun to express themselves, that they live in a timeless world of desire and satisfaction, and thus total contentment. Rousseau says that these human animals possess a blind will to live, and may use any means necessary to satisfy that will. Rousseau calls this instinct self-love, and it is the ultimate fountain of every other human quality that develops over time. But Rousseau also sneaks in another instinct, one that he seems to say is as primal and irresistible as our will to live. That is, the human animal can feel pity. He can be moved to compassion when seeing another creature like him or her in distress or danger. It is this core characteristic that gave the most primitive humans the first incentive to take an interest in a life besides their own. Once these abilities do begin to develop, each benefit they confer is paid for with some loss of contentment, and thus happiness. And Rousseau thinks those abilities will inevitably develop, because humans in the original state of nature confront problems that test their inventiveness, and so compel them to change and adapt. The potentials that humans carry within them, like seeds, are planted and cultivated by the demands of life in nature, and over time, those developing potentials fundamentally alter human beings. Consider two individuals in the state of nature, say the parents of a newborn. They realize that their chances of survival improve if they work together to sustain themselves. As soon as they do this, they have established within their blank minds the concept of a relationship that can be evaluated in terms of good or bad, helpful or unhelpful. To survive, two is better than one. Certain animals are dangerous, while others are not. The members of our hypothetical little family, by coming to understand the importance of relations, then begin to see themselves as somehow distinct from other humans. Once the concept of relationships are established, Rousseau traces a process that functions in some ways like evolution by natural selection, in that chance affects the possibility of different developments, making them more or less likely. The most primal acts of human cooperation multiply and deepen, since new forms of cooperation make new activities possible. An individual may build a shelter for herself, but not a household, a productive oikos like the one Aristotle described. A family, though, may build a household, but not a village, while a village is the precondition for the development of a city. The various human potentials for language, reason, passion, and so on emerge and develop in response to these stimuli. Depending on their means of cooperation, humans may construct simple societies in which some qualities are encouraged and others are discouraged. Regardless of the specific course of development, the human mind undergoes an accelerated pace of development. It takes societies generations to articulate and integrate the various connections between individuals and groups that make up the total dynamic of social life. But for the individual mind, these articulations and connections of life experiences happen moment by moment, day by day. The ultimate effect of this is the emergence of self-consciousness, the ability to contemplate ourselves, observe and evaluate our decisions, and so judge our behavior and the behavior of others. Self-consciousness is what gives us our sense of self. It makes us human because it makes us individuals, and as such, makes us responsible for the things we do and the choices we make. This trend increases the complexity of human life and improves its material basis. For Rousseau, primitive human communities are wealthier and safer than the nomads of the state of nature, and modern states possess any number of advantages over primitive communities. But this material improvement comes at the cost of happiness, as qualities like greed, brutality, and selfishness develop and articulate their power to shape social life. Every convenience of life, every object or practice or idea that eases the hard necessities of day-to-day living creates dependence. Over time, these conveniences become so integral to the functioning of society that they transform themselves into necessities. New conveniences are developed that go through the same cycle of social integration, and over time, society becomes more complex, more cumbersome, and more fragile. Complexity requires hierarchy. For Rousseau, no society in history has managed the problem of increasing complexity without resorting to some form of coercive social order, in which the labor of the many ultimately benefits the wealthy few. The rough equality that is possible in simple, underdeveloped societies becomes impossible once a certain threshold of complexity is reached, and violence, exploitation, and tyranny become necessary to maintain the material benefits of complexity. This is the source of constantly growing unhappiness, since in each generation, more and more people are compelled to surrender their own will and their own desires to serve some part of the vast machine of society, which must continue to function in order to preserve life. Civilization, then, is a kind of trap, a gilded cage for the human race. Much of this development can occur within the state of nature. Unlike Hobbes or John Locke, Rousseau does not identify the foundation of a state with the moment of transition out of nature. Instead, Rousseau identifies the departure from nature with the moment the first person staked out a piece of land for his own exclusive use and called it his private property. For Rousseau, this moment serves the same function as the biblical story of the fall of Adam and Eve. It is the moment in which human beings lose whatever innocence they retained from their life as contented animals. Whereas an English gentleman like John Locke would argue that private property is the original human innovation, the basis on which all laws and governments rest, Rousseau takes the opposite view, which so happens to be the one better backed up by the historical record. For Rousseau, private property implies the existence of a government with enough laws and enough force at its disposal to defend the rights of property owners. Since private property necessarily means that an owner has the exclusive right to its use, there must be a code that spells out the rules of ownership and the punishments for violations of those owners' rights. Otherwise, there is no private property as we would understand it, but just a series of selfish claims that are only as strong as the person making them. Hence, the invention of private property serves as the climax of human development, the moment when humans fully depart nature and live under rules of their own devising. In this state, humans may be well-fed, well-clothed, wealthy, and strong. But the price is unhappiness, thwarted freedom, and constant exposure to the corrupting effects of society. The simple virtues of primitive life are supplanted by the vices of civilization: greed, violence, selfishness. What's worse, these vices provide the content of our own inner lives, the unique human ability to understand ourselves as individuals with a subjective self-conscious all their own. Hence, civilized life makes us neurotic. It makes us sick in ways that would not have been imaginable in earlier stages of development. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis and one of the architects of 20th century life, drew heavily on Rousseau in his own book on society's contradictions, titled Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud too sees society as a kind of trap in which we sacrifice freedom and autonomy for security and comfort. The pressures and contradictions of civilized life express themselves as mental illness, which serves as a kind of index for the ills of a given society. But neither Freud nor Rousseau believed it would be desirable or possible to somehow return to this primitive state of being. Humans cannot undo their development. Even if they ruin the material basis of their existence, they cannot erase their inner lives. Their self-consciousness, our self-consciousness, is what it is, the product of a history that cannot be rolled back. So it is fruitless to wish for a return to some pre-conscious Eden. If we are to overcome the ills of society and unlearn the vices it encourages, we must push forward and build a society that makes that possible. Here we have Rousseau, the social revolutionary. Since humans are the products of their environments and their decisions, it follows that the transformation of those environments and the transformation of those decisions will yield different kinds of humans. For Rousseau, politics is a means of renovating society, regenerating its institutions and values through the application of power. And thanks to the changes wrought by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, humans now possess the knowledge and the technology to make such renovations possible. As mentioned earlier, the French revolutionaries had all read their Rousseau, and the more radical among them saw in the revolution the chance to apply Rousseau's concepts and reshape society in such a way that would produce good, virtuous citizens of a free republic of equals. The Jacobin regime, whose reign of terror saved the revolution from defeat, committed itself to a program of reform that aimed to restore human happiness by building a society that encouraged virtue and discouraged vice. Though this effort was violently suppressed, this Jacobin current in politics survived, becoming a fundamental element of revolutionary socialism and, over time, a default assumption of modern states that rely on democratic legitimacy.